Hey, good morning, everyone. It is so good to be together again. It's also good to see, can I see a few new faces? So, happy Sabbath. We're glad you've joined us this morning. As Jeff has explained, we're envisioning this time together very much as a conversation. And it's going to be a little harder this morning, because it's a larger group logistically. But what we're going to do is we're going to try to do the same thing we have been doing the other nights. We're going to be asking questions, asking you to discuss them. We're going to have mics that are roving so you can share with the rest of the community that is here. And what we're envisioning happening here is that as we as a community that has been drawn together in some mysterious way by the Holy Spirit, right? As we're gathered together around these tables, around the Word of God, we're going to be looking at the Gospels. And as we converse and wrestle with what Jesus is saying, that somehow through it, the Spirit that has drawn us here will speak to us, that God will speak to us, that something you say will speak to the person at your table, something your table says will speak to the rest of the room, to me, and vice versa. So that's what we're hoping to do. So don't be afraid to speak up. So today we're going to be doing that again, another fundamental issue. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark. We've been in the Mark all week. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verse 14 through 23. I'll just go ahead and read it so we can get the text out on the table and we can talk about it together. Mark chapter 7, verse 14 through 23. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of the men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean." All right, I already know what part of this passage most of you want to talk about. Right? Second half of verse 19. What does that mean, that text? I'm going to suggest that this is not the main point of the passage, so that we should not fixate on it this morning, because if we did, we would be missing the gorilla that is walking through the room. This passage, what Jesus is trying to communicate to us, isn't about that one text, the second half of verse 19. So we're going to set it aside and let you debate it, maybe over lunch today. What is Jesus talking about? Well, what Jesus is talking about in this passage is, one way you could say it is he's talking to his followers about the nature of holiness. Okay, and those of you are like, that's a really weird word. I'll give you another weird word, sanctification. It's another way you could talk about what Jesus is talking about. He talks about clean and unclean. Jeff asked the question, when we talk about it a lot of times we use the word spiritual, right? So what makes a person spiritual and what makes a person unspiritual? Okay? So to get us thinking about it, let's continue what Jeff asked you to talk about around your tables, right? And I'm going to ask you the same version of the question, and you can continue talking about it if you want to use the language of spirituality. And the question is this. I'd like you to think about people in your life and think about the holiest person that you know. Okay, and if you don't like the word holy, think about the most spiritual person you know, right? Or if you don't like any of that language, think about the most Christian person you know, all right? And think about that person. Maybe you could mention their name if you don't think they'd mind with the people sitting at your table. And discuss and share what is it about that person that makes them holy, spiritual, Christian, etc., etc., etc. Right? Everybody get it? Thinking about a spiritual holy person. It could be somebody you know, it could be somebody in the news, somebody that you read about in a book, all right? Who is this person and what made them so spiritual, holy, perfect, or sanctified, all right? All right, so we'll give you, let's take 4 minutes to do this, okay? Okay. Sounds like there's good conversations happening around those tables. Share the wealth with everybody else, huh? Let's see what you've come up with. So we have some mics that are going to be roving around the room. So don't be shy. If you want to represent your table, share what you talked about. You can raise your hand and we'll try to get a mic to you. I guess really quickly, we should say that the holiest person, I should have said this before, the holiest person that you know can't be yourself, okay? So you'll be talking about somebody else. So, okay, so over here, yes.
Since the Bible tells us not to judge people, I'm curious why you're asking us to judge how holy people are.
Okay, all right. So just threw the whole question out. We should not judge. You're saying positively or negatively. So
it's God's place to do that, not
God's
ours.
place to. All right. Well, I guess that was a really short discussion of what we're going to talk about. Right, so yeah, but I think this is a good answer. We really can't judge who is holy or who is not holy because there's motive and stuff involved, and only God knows those things. So I think that's a very good point. Okay, with that said, is there anybody else you'd like to nominate for the holiest person of the year? Yes.
Well, I don't know if I can necessarily pinpoint a certain person, but I'm thinking holiness depends on who's looking at it. The Pharisees, they looked at Christ. And they didn't see holiness, yet that's who he was. And yet the lowliest person looked at Christ and they saw holiness. So I'm thinking it depends on your perspective, what you're looking at, what you're looking for.
Interesting. So holiness is this like ambiguous term. And so the Pharisees last night we looked at Jesus and said he was a drunkard and a glutton. And that was, I think, for them the exact opposite of holiness. But you're saying that there's other people who encountered Jesus and he was holy, whatever this means. So it's this like flexible term depending on who's using it. That's an interesting thought. Anyone else? Yes, over here.
Okay, I'd like to give a shout out to my mom who's not here.
All right.
So I can do this. I'm enjoying it. My mom was not, as I grew up, I was kind of wondering about her because she never really told me like, son, be sure to read your Bible today, be sure to pray today. She never really affected me in that way. But just an overview, I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and in 2000 our house burnt down, and she's been a single mother all my life.
Okay.
And so as I've gotten older, and just to know the hard things that she took us through, and the decisions she made, the sacrifices she made for her kids, it was always about her kids, always. We could have moved in 2000 to Colorado to her sisters and been close to family there, but she said that she realized we had roots here, we had friends here, and she didn't want to move us because she moved around as a kid a lot. And as I get older, the more I talk to her, the more I realize just the hard things that she had to do and the faith that she had in God to trust that like we had like bills to pay, food to have, like we don't know where this money is going to come from.
Yeah.
And she just got credit card debt on top of credit card debt, just saying, God, one day, we'll pay it off one day. Like this is in your hands. And just those type of things that I realized that she did really, it makes me amazed at what type of woman my mom is.
Okay. So you said you're the youngest of 6 kids, and she's a single mom raising 6 boys, or 6 kids. Wow, okay. Yes, sanctified. Okay. Literally, the word holy means to be set apart. That's literally what it means, that you have taken something and you've said that I'm going to set it apart for some other purpose. Somebody's explained to me that if you want to talk about it in contemporary lingo, making something weird. Okay, so there's normal and there's weird, and weird things are sanctified things, all right? Now, so the question becomes, what is it that makes this thing that is different from everything else, or this person that is different from everybody else, different? What is it that makes something or someone holy? You know, this is a really important issue, and I think this is it's an issue that I really misunderstood for a really, really long time. Then I started reading what Jesus had to say about the topic. And as he usually does, he really challenged what I thought and changed the way I'm thinking about it. I thought about it and I am thinking about it, right? And one of the passages where I think Jesus is crystal clear about what he means by the word holiness, what it means to be a holy, sanctified Christian person, is found in the passage we're going to be diving into this morning. We've heard it read, okay? So let's turn to it and let's look at it a little more closely, and we'll try to figure out what Jesus is saying. Okay, so let's look at the context. So we're going to zoom out a little bit and try to ask the question, why is Jesus talking about clean and unclean? Okay, well, so if you go to the beginning of a few verses before, or the very beginning of the chapter in Mark 7, you see that Jesus is in a dispute with some of the religious leaders of his time. And the dispute is about washing hands. Okay, so Jesus and his followers are eating, and they eat without washing their hands. Right? How many of you have the bad habit of doing that? You go to the restaurant, and you're about to eat like a burrito. And you think in your mind, I should go wash my hands. And then you look at the burrito, which you're already holding, and you think, no, I'll just eat this, right? Dirty. All right. Now, so the text explains that the religious leaders, if you read it, verses 1 through 5, they had this elaborate ritual of washing their hands before they eat. And Mark explains to us why in verses 3 and 4. The Pharisees do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. Where they come from, from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Okay, so the religious leaders, their reason for washing their hands is very, well, I guess it's simple. It's really not, but it is, if you understand the reasoning, okay? So the religious leaders of Jesus' day, they know that there are all these unclean things that they're not supposed to really be around. So if you read the Old Testament, there's a holiness code. It says that there's these foods, there's these kinds of people, there's these kinds of things that you should not associate with, you should not touch, you should not eat, okay? And so the concern here is that if the Pharisees, they have been out all day amongst the people, shaking their hands, going to the marketplace, touching food. You really have no idea when you're about to eat what is on your hands and how that might enter your body and make you unclean. Okay, so here's an example. One of the things that we know that in the Jewish culture that they thought was unclean to eat was pig. Okay, so let's say you go to the marketplace and you encounter a butcher. And you shake the butcher's hand, you're like, hey, Bob, have a nice day, okay? Now you go home, and you're about to eat your meal, okay? The concern is here, if you don't wash your hands properly, when you eat your food, what are you eating? Through your contact with the butcher. Okay, you're eating pig. Okay, so you want to make sure you wash your hands, because you never know who you've come in contact with, right? Some of you have the good habit, those of you that, are conscious about this. You have like the little sanitizing thing in your pocket or your purse, and you pull it out and you make sure that the bacteria and the viruses have been removed, okay? So today we have this concern to sanitize our hands for health reasons. We don't want the bacteria coming in, right? In Jesus' day, there was a concern. When it wasn't about bacteria, it was spiritual contamination, okay? And the mentality was, if I touch your hand and your hand has touched something unclean, you are defiling me. Okay? And this didn't extend just to like food. It extended to everything, like people. Like if you're not Jewish and you're a Gentile, that's most of us in this room. Okay? You're unclean, right? And so when I eat food, I definitely don't want your germs on me. All right? And so the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day are deeply concerned about holiness, about their spiritual well-being, and they think it really revolves around washing hands and touching. Now Jesus, in his teaching, and this is what's so amazingly ingenious about Jesus, he enters this debate about practices, cleanliness practices, and instead of talking about the practice itself, which is where most of us like to argue, right? He engages the thought process and the mentality that people have that is driving this debate. And what is this mentality? What is this thought process? It is this. The basic premise is the idea is that there are things outside of us or outside of people that are unclean, and the inside is clean, and what we need to regulate is to make sure that the things that are outside don't come into the inside. So there's certain kinds of people, there's certain kinds of foods, and there's certain environments that you want to avoid. C.S. Lewis tells a story about a young boy who was asked, what do you think God is like? And the young boy says, oh, it's really easy. God is the kind of person that looks to see if people are having fun, and then he tries to get them to stop. Can I tell this little story here because this is the way that I think a lot of us, we really think about holiness, right? Is there's things out in the world and people out in the world, and these things taste good, they're a lot of fun, they're beautiful, and if I'm going to be spiritual and take my spirituality seriously, my number one priority is I need to prevent those outside forces, people, and things from entering this temple. Okay? Because I do not want it to corrupt me. Now, most of us don't engage in elaborate cleansing rituals before we eat. Some of you may. But we have our own 21st century ways of dealing with pollution on the outside. Two of these practices. One is called abstinence, which is we cut this thing, person, or place out of our life. Okay? And the other method I would suggest to you is called withdrawal. Okay? And this means that you know that if you're around this thing, you can't avoid the temptation. You know if you go to this place or you're around this person, it's going to be too much. And so you withdraw altogether from that place or those people. You're just not around them anymore. So this leads to an understanding of holiness, spirituality, religion as primarily being about being away from other people, not being around certain things, cutting stuff out. Are you the only one, or have you been there too? Am I the only one, or have you been there? I remember when I first, and this was in college, I first started taking my walk with God seriously. Right? I remember one of the first things I did is I went home and I threw away all my CDs. So I had my Stone Temple Pilots, and this is dating me, my Smashing Pumpkins, and all these other, my Erasure, okay? And I was like, you know what? If I'm going to get real about God, I can't listen to this stuff anymore. And so I threw it all away, okay? So there it is. See the mentality? Here's this music, and it's like got bad stuff in it. And if I listen to it, these forces are coming in and I don't know, corrupting my thoughts, okay? And so I need to get rid of these things. Now, there's a problem with this. And there's lots of problems with this way of thinking. One of the problems I think we should be concerned about as a church is that it leads to, basically, it's a church which is supposed to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world, to basically withdraw from associating with the world. Okay, because the people are dirty. The worldly people, the secular people are dirty and unspiritual, and I'm spiritual, and we're going to build this huge wall and keep those dark forces out there, and we will be pure and holy in here. But you know what that makes everybody who's on the outside think about us? This is what I've learned. I used to think when I was in college that the problem that secular people had with religion, with Christianity, was intellectual. And so I got into apologetics and reading philosophy. I even went to school for it. And I love this stuff. But I really thought, if I could just sit down with somebody and talk with them about what is true, right? That I could convince them that what I believe was true, and then if I could convince them what I believe was true, they would come to church with me one day. It's been 10, 15 years since I've been in college, and I have learned that for most people, the problem with Christianity, with religion, with belief in God, is not intellectual, okay? For some people it is, but for most people it's not. Here's what I've learned. For most people who are not in church, who are not here this morning, and think you're crazy because you are, thinks that being a religious person is ethically problematic. Not intellectually problematic. Some people think it's both. It's morally problematic, which means it makes you a kind of person that is worse than they are by becoming religious. Right? Well, how so? Well, two ways. First, the claim is that becoming religious makes you otherworldly. You cease to care about the world and the real problems in the world, and you're waiting around to go to heaven or for Jesus to come back. And this makes you morally passive and an escapist. And so you withdraw into your community or your commune, and the world is going, how do you say this? It's going really bad, okay? Things are going really, really bad, okay? And instead of going out there and trying to do something about it, you're sitting there waiting, saying, I don't want to get my hands dirty, and one day somebody else, something else will make it all better. This is the beam me up, Scotty approach to spirituality. And the second objection is just plainly, it makes you prudish and boring. Right? You used to be so fun, and now, like, if it's fun, if it feels good, you don't do it at all. And now people are like, I don't want to hang out with you anymore. Are these fears well grounded? Does Christianity result in these kinds of character traits in people? Is there something inherent in Christian belief and practice that results in otherworldliness and prudishness? If you misunderstand holiness, yes, that's exactly what happens. So the question becomes, once again, returning back to this passage, is what is Jesus trying to say? Jesus is saying that holiness is not what many of us think it is. He says, nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. He continues on and he gives us a different understanding of holiness. And I say, the way I understand it, is instead of talking about holiness in purely negative terms, as in what I avoid and what I don't do, he says holiness is something that is about what you do, positive holiness. Okay? So let's look at this. So Mark 7:20, this is what Jesus says. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make him unclean. Now, I was thinking about this long list of unclean things that come out of people. And I thought of another passage, actually. This is in Paul in Galatians. Some of you are probably thinking about this. What does Paul talk about in Galatians 5? That is like the exact opposite of this list. The fruits of the Spirit. Okay? Paul describes it like this. He says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, it's joy, it's peace, and it's patience, it's kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Jesus says uncleanliness is these anger and malice and lust that comes out. Okay? If you're going to reverse what Jesus has to say, just go to Paul. If uncleanliness is these things, cleanliness, holiness, okay, is love, it's peace, it's joy. In other words, holiness is about primarily what is coming out of us. What are we saying? What are we doing? Not primarily measured by all the things we avoid. There's somebody that I started reading recently that really has helped me understand this concept. John Wesley. John Wesley is the real pioneer and forerunner of Adventism. Okay, Ellen White was a Methodist before she was an Adventist. John Wesley talks a lot about sanctification, holiness. And what he's famous for is this idea is that God can not only justify people through the cross, but through the work of the Spirit in people's lives can sanctify them. That's what he went around teaching. Right? And he believed that this work of sanctification could happen in this life. That's what he taught. Does this sound familiar to some of you that have hung around the Adventist church for a while? right? Sanctification is something that can happen in this life, right? This is what he says, two things that I think are so important. He says, this work of sanctification is the work of God. It is what God does in people. And then when you ask the question, well, what does it look like? He says this. He says, sanctification is perfect love for God and neighbor. Perfect love for God and neighbor. And then he makes these qualifications. He says, perfect love for God and neighbor is not the same thing as perfect knowledge of God and neighbor. Okay, and because I don't have perfect knowledge, I may do something to you that hurts you, that offends you, but it's not coming from a place where I'm intending to do it. I'm doing it because of misinformation and misunderstanding, right? And so Wesley's got this idea is that what God wants to do in people is make them loving people. And he can do that in this life. Wesley's conception of holiness, I think, was deeply informed by Jesus' teachings. Jesus' conception of holiness as what you do for others. Who is my neighbor? Jesus said, somebody asked Jesus. Jesus says, well, I'll tell you who your neighbor is. Your neighbor is the person who just got beat up and is on the side of the road and nobody else is doing anything for that person. That's your neighbor. Now, what are you doing for that person? Because that's holiness. I was thinking about the holy people I know in my life. And these are the people that convict me and inspire me at the same time. Last night I shared with you about my friends Rusty and Stacy who moved to Section 8 housing, right? Think of two other people in my life. And the people I'm thinking of this morning, very different from who I would have thought of like 10 years ago. Because my understanding of holiness has changed. Okay? I'll give you an example. Maybe this sounds like some of the people you're talking around your table without judging them. I think of this one lady at my church, Mary Green. I got her permission this morning to talk about her. She said it was okay, right? Because she's not a person that wants to be talked about from up front, right? Mary Green, lady at my church, she's like the matriarch. She's like in her 80s. She's got white hair. Her husband, before he passed away, was the manager of the ABC. Okay? Mary Green, you know, I remember when I first met her, she's like this soft-spoken, gentle lady. She'd ask me, how is your courage? Right? And she welcomed me to the church when I started working there about a year ago. Wanted to know how it was for me, what the church could do to make me feel welcome. Then I found out about her story. Her husband just passed away like 2 years ago, and she is still in a state of mourning his death. But that's not what she wants to talk about when she first meets you. What she wants to talk about is the card ministry at our church, where she sends cards to every member in our church for their birthday and on holidays. Hand-picks cards. It's a small church, right? But hand-picks the cards so that they mean something and writes a little note, right? Then I find out, like, you know, the husband has passed away and that she's so sad most of the time. I find out that once a week she goes to Gordon Hospital in Calhoun and is a volunteer chaplain there, visiting people who are in the hospital, right? And I look at her sitting in the back of the church every week, and I'm like, man, this woman is a saint, right? This is a holy woman. I was thinking of my roommate who I talked to this morning because I wanted to get his permission to talk about him too, from college, right? He's pastoring up in Michigan. His name is Ilko. I was going to talk about this point in the talk. I was going to talk about Mother Teresa, but I was like, none of us know Mother Teresa. So I was thinking about the people I know that are doing what I think Jesus is talking about. My friend Ilko, he pastors in Michigan. I got a Christmas card from him this year, you know, the one where people send pictures of their families. And I knew that a year or so before he had his first kid. And so I was really surprised that when I got this little card, to see that there was like 4 kids in this picture. Him and his wife have 4 kids. I'm like, 4 kids? Like, how did this happen, right? And so we're talking. I'm like, Ilko, how do you have 4 kids? And he told me, he goes, no, Megan and I are foster parents for these 3 kids that are in our neighborhood or in our community, right? So it's not a formal adoption for a long time, but they've taken these kids in that don't have homes or are in duress, and they have brought them into their home and put them on their Christmas card. Right? And so I talked to him this morning, and he said, let me give you an update. these kids aren't with us anymore, they're with their grandparents, but there's somebody else that's in our home, and it's a 15-year-old woman or girl that's has a child that had a baby out of wedlock. And now this is their adopted daughter and foster daughter and grandson. Right? I look at that and I think about my roommate, and I'm like, man, this is one holy guy. He's a normal guy, but he's holy, right? Holiness, I would suggest to you, is about what you do rather than what you avoid. But I know some of you are thinking about this already, and you're like, no. See, but there's this relationship between things you don't do and the things you do, right? But this is a really confusing issue here in our community. And for those of you who aren't into these kinds of debates, just check out here for the next 2 minutes. For those of you who are, listen for a little bit. Some people will say, every time you use the word holiness or sanctification, you're being a legalist. Okay, so this is the way a lot of debates in our community go in the Adventist church. Some of us want to dismiss all concepts of holiness and sanctification and say, you know what, it's all justification, Jesus did it on the cross, let's not talk about it anymore. Okay? And then there are others of us who say, no. Christ's character perfectly reproduced in his people. That is what Adventism is about, right? And so we're going to hang on to those distinctive lifestyle practices that we have. And then what we eat, what we drink, what we do for entertainment, we're going to hold on to those things, and we're going to say, no. If you're going to be serious about God, you got to buckle down on those issues. And so now we have a debate in our church between people who are liberals and conservatives, whatever you call yourself. The person you disagree with is that nasty title that you don't apply to yourself, right? And so we draw these lines, and what the debate really is about, I would suggest to you, is what Jesus is talking about here. It's about holiness. Right? We want to be holy, like the Bible says we should be. We just don't know what that's supposed to look like. Is it negative? Is it positive? How does it come together? I would suggest to you, and this is my way to try to make sense of this debate, is that both sides of the debate are probably mistaken because they're working from a wrong conception of holiness. The problem is not, should we abandon or embrace holiness? And so I'm not suggesting that we should abandon certain practices, but that we need to try to understand why we do them and understand their relative importance. The crucial question I think we need to wrestle with, and I'm going to ask you to wrestle with this here in a couple seconds, is we need to learn to ask ourselves, how does this thing that I avoid or I do help me or hinder me from loving other people? Okay, I'm going to repeat it one more time because I want us to talk about this. How does what I do or refuse to do, because I want to be holy, help me or hinder me from loving other people? How does it help make me a more loving person, or does it make me a less loving person? If you think about this seriously, I've been trying to think about this seriously, it does this very weird thing in you. It makes you more liberal and more conservative at once at the same time. Okay? So can I give you a couple examples before I ask you to try to think about this? All right. Let's think about, I'll talk about food and drink, okay? So I've grown up most of my life, and I've been told that I should be vegetarian. And the two reasons that were usually given for this is that I would live longer, 7 years longer than everybody else on average, and that somehow that me avoiding certain animal products is spiritually significant. In other words, not eating meat was a mark of sanctification and holiness. Here's the thing that's kind of thrown my head for a spin, is recently I have met people that are not Christians, that don't belong to the Adventist church, who are vegetarian and vegan, okay? And I ask them, why are you vegetarian and why are you vegan? And you know what they tell me? Maybe you have some friends like this? They say things like this, it's better for the environment and kinder to animals. Really? Yes, eating meat is really cruel to animals. That's what the argument is. It does bad things to the environment. And so I'm thinking, as I'm thinking about motivations for why I do what I do, like, what's a more Jesus-like reason for being a vegetarian? Because I care about the animals, or because I want to live a really, really long time? You know what I'm saying? So I think we can take almost any issue that people like to debate about, or should you be doing this, should you not be doing it, and you could ask the question, what does me doing this or not doing this do to help or hinder me from loving other people? So here's what I want you to talk about at your tables next, and I want to talk about this together as a community gathered here this morning. What are some things that you try not to do, or told not to do, or don't do, or do, because you're walking with God or trying to walk with God? And how does this help you or hinder you from loving other people? Everybody get the question or the questions? All right, so you take any topic. It could be a topic like, it could be the eating thing, it could be jewelry, movie theaters, whatever you want to talk about, okay? And ask the question, what does avoiding it or not avoiding it do to help or hinder actually loving somebody else? Okay? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this. Think about it. And then we'll come back together and see what you get. All right. Anybody want to be the first to dive in and explain or give an example of how this works? Okay, something that you do or do not do because you're trying to walk with Jesus. How does it help or hinder you in loving others? Who wants to go first? There's all this conversation, but evidently we're talking about something else. Maybe? Nobody want to go? In the back, yes.
All right. Good morning. Well, we talk about several things. One of them was food. Being a vegetarian, sometimes you may be invited somewhere where they cook like chicken or some other form of meat.
Okay.
And, sometimes you're kind of like, well, I don't eat chicken or I don't eat meat. And then that person who took the time to really prepare the meal for you, you kind of just take away that joy of sharing with them, whereas, eating the meat is not necessarily like something to your salvation. So sometimes eating with the person would be better than pushing them away or not going because meat will be served there. And then the other aspect was with relationships. Sometimes, you might be invited to a birthday party or to a wedding, but because it's taking place on the Sabbath, you may choose not to go. And again, it takes away from spending time with your family members simply because you differ in your beliefs and,
Those are like two great examples. How many of you have been stuck in a position like that, and you're like, what do I do, right? You can relate with this? So this is really nice. And so this principle here of asking like, okay, now what's the loving thing to do with my family, with this person who's just prepared this meal for me? And how that consideration might be more important than like, is it going to defile the temple or not, right? Because it's what's coming out and what I'm doing with this relationship that Jesus cares about. That's great. Anybody else? Okay, we got one over here and then we'll come over to the middle. Yeah.
We focused on apparel.
Okay.
For instance, young ladies maybe that come to church and have maybe more shorter skirts, and it's offensive to some people. But I mean, maybe those people, or you don't know their background, so some people are quick to jump on them and get onto them, and maybe they might have realized that later in their walk, and they're not quite there, but someone jumps in quick and it hinders them and they may not even want to come to church anymore.
Yeah.
And that kind of discourages them. And I also had one more. This is a true story here.
Okay, sure.
Someone I know got pregnant out of wedlock, and they've been in the church for a while, I guess 10 years maybe. And since she's got pregnant, they don't want her to come up and do special music and or do any scripture reading or anything anymore in church, and that's kind of got her discouraged right now. So that's all I got.
That's something to think about. How do you deal with that in a loving way as a community? Is there somebody else? Yeah, I don't. That's great for something I think for all of us to think about, wrestle with. Yeah, over here at this table.
You know, as far as this subject go, the way that I decide to look at it is that everything comes in cycles.
In cycles?
Yeah, for every action there is an opposite and equal reaction, as they put it. So the thing about it is when you're doing something, unless you know the reason why you're doing it, it becomes kind of pointless.
That's right.
And unless your reasoning is, as you would put it, in accordance with the word, it kind of breaks the cycle. It hurts the cycle. It causes a reaction that you don't want. An example of what I'm trying to say is, for example, he mentioned the skirts of somebody walking into the church. Now, the thing about it is that while, yes, you can look at that person and be like, this is a new person into the church, we need to calm down, let them have a chance to learn and understand. Yes, this here is necessary. But also, what they're doing can also be distracting someone else from, for lack of a better word, their spiritual walk.
Yeah.
They're sitting in church, they're trying to pay attention to what's going on up front, and miniskirt walks by. And there goes the eyes.
This does happen, ladies.
And that I think that is why I said it's a cycle. So you have to find a way to put the cycle on balance per se.
Well, so and I think, how do we put it in balance? I think a good way to think about it is what if everybody that's involved in this situation is thinking, what am I doing or not doing that is helping me love other people? This is both the person who's wearing the dress and both the person who's bothered by the dress, right? If we were all doing it, I think...
Yeah, we the person who's wearing the dress take consideration for the person who's looking, and the person who's looking take consideration for the person who's wearing, and eventually both of them are going to fall in line.
I think that makes sense. I mean, it's harder to put in practice, but theoretically it's beautiful. That's how it should be working, and I think that's how Jesus envisions it. Yeah.
On the helping and hindering question about loving others, one thing that we talked about at our table was your motivation for the things that you do and don't do, because personally, I'm a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian my whole life. But it wasn't. My parents didn't raise us that way for a spiritual reason. It was a health reason. So when I'm around my friends who aren't vegetarians, I never even think about being judgmental or anything like that, or not loving them because they don't eat meat, because it's not a spiritual thing for me. But when it's things that I have let go of for spiritual reasons, like for me it's music or movies or things like that, I tend to look at other people like, well, you haven't gotten the light yet on this, and perhaps you really ought to raise your standard. And I find myself more judgmental in the things that I've done for spiritual reasons than the things I've just done because for health concerns or whatever. And that's the struggle that I have with, am I loving others and I'm thinking these thoughts even if I don't say anything, or am I not loving them? And also on the flip side with vegetarianism, I think we should also consider loving vegetarians by not forcing meat on them.
That's true.
I mean, if we want to love everybody, it's difficult because if you've been raised vegetarian, it's not an issue of I don't love you, I don't want to eat your meat. It's just that you're not used to it. So we could also think of loving vegetarians too.
Oh, it goes both ways.
Yeah, it goes both ways.
Both ways. All right, couple more comments. And then I think, yes, in the back, we'll try to distribute evenly the comments. Yes?
I think a lot of principles have been brought out that are great. The principles, the motives, but when it comes down to it, like the different situations, like the wedding, even mini skirts, like should I talk to that person or not? It comes down to us being connected with Christ and having that abiding relationship with Him to discern, because sometimes God would have us to step out and maybe share with our brother and sister, or go to the wedding or not go to the wedding. So it comes down to motive, principle, and also are we calling out to God and having that that connection with him, to know what he would have us to do moment by moment.
Nice. Thank you.
I think it's.
Go ahead.
I think it's really, you have to ask yourself, is this affecting my
from
walk
Jose,
with
get
Christ?
from
Or is it connecting me to Christ more? Because if you get into like, well, this person is wearing this, or dress reform, or health message, sometimes it just detracts from your walk, you know?
Yeah.
You become legalists. It's not healthy.
Yeah. Well, there's something, and this has come up, there's something, we have to ask ourselves a question. Is me avoiding this and then it makes me a less loving person? We got to look at what's going on there, because that's not the point of it, right? Anyway, I'm getting the sign here that we need to start wrapping it up. All right. So let's start landing the plane here. Quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer: "Being a Christian is less about cautiously avoiding sin than about courageously and actively doing God's will." 1 Peter 1:15. "Be just as he who called you is holy. Be holy in all you do. For it is written, 'Be holy because I am holy.'" Be holy because I am holy. Here's the last thought I'd like to close us out with. Holy is being set apart. What is it that sets God apart from all other gods and non-gods? Is it God's transcendence and power? Or is it what Jesus shows us, which is his eminence and closeness to broken people? Right? Maybe it's both. It's a tension of God being transcendent, but in his transcendence, coming close to people. Right? And that's the holiness. And what this text means, when we look at it in the light of what Jesus shows us about God, is that we are called at the same time to do the same thing with people, that we are holy when, like God, we are incarnational, we are coming close to broken people and places, and in those moments when we are being those kinds of people, we are being holy. The love of God. There's a song that I really love. And the beginning of the song goes like this: "How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure." To be holy is to be set apart. What sets you apart? And it's my prayer for you and for myself that it would be the many things I do for people, rather than just the things I avoid.